He was called to testify about discrimination in a courthouse his own company was renovating, but when he walked through those doors, he became the victim of the very bias he was there to expose, proving that injustice can happen anywhere, even in the halls where justice is supposed to be served. Watch as Marcus Thompson, a successful construction CEO, gets mistaken for a criminal defendant while carrying blueprints of the federal courthouse he's renovating, faces shocking accusations of document forgery and attempted perjury by court staff who refuse to verify his legitimate credentials, stays impossibly calm while being threatened with federal arrest for trying to provide expert testimony about the discrimination he's experiencing in real time, and then delivers the most devastating revelation ever witnessed in a federal courthouse when he proves he's the contractor building the very building they're trying to remove him from. This isn't just about one man's fight for respect in a place dedicated to justice. It's about exposing how institutional bias infects even the courts meant to protect us from discrimination, and how one person's courage to demand equal treatment sparked reforms that transformed the entire federal justice system. Stay until the end to see how this courthouse confrontation created changes that now protect every American seeking justice. Because what happens when the federal judge discovers the truth will restore your faith that accountability can come even to those who think they're above it.
He was called to testify about discrimination in a courthouse his own company was renovating, but when he walked through those doors, he became the victim of the very bias he was there to expose, proving that injustice can happen anywhere, even in the halls where justice is supposed to be served. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, and what happened to him in a federal courthouse will make you question whether the system designed to protect us from discrimination is itself infected by the very prejudice it's meant to eliminate. Marcus Thompson had spent 25 years building Thompson Construction and Development from a small family business into a $400 million empire that specialized in renovating the most important buildings in America, courthouses, federal offices, and government facilities that served as the backbone of the justice system. At 51, Marcus had overseen the construction and renovation of over 200 government buildings across 15 states, earning a reputation for delivering projects on time, under budget, and with the kind of attention to detail that made his work a symbol of American craftsmanship. But Marcus's success wasn't just about building impressive structures. Every courthouse he renovated, every federal building he restored, carried the weight of his personal mission to create spaces where justice could truly be served equally. He understood that the physical environment where legal decisions were made could either reinforce dignity and fairness or perpetuate the barriers that kept people from accessing equal treatment under the law. The irony of this particular day was almost too perfect to believe. Marcus was scheduled to testify as an expert witness in Richardson v. Pinnacle Construction, a landmark federal discrimination case that would set precedent for how the construction industry addressed bias in hiring and contracting. The plaintiff, a black-owned engineering firm, alleged that major construction companies systematically excluded minority contractors from lucrative government projects, creating a cycle of discrimination that had persisted for decades. Marcus's testimony was crucial because his company had successfully broken through these barriers, proving that minority-owned construction firms could not only compete with established players but could exceed their performance on the most challenging and prestigious projects. His expertise would provide the court with real-world evidence of both the discrimination that existed and the solutions that could eliminate it. The federal courthouse where this historic trial was taking place held special significance for Marcus beyond his testimony. Thompson Construction and Development was simultaneously completing a $12 million renovation of this very building, upgrading everything from the security systems to the accessibility features that would make justice more accessible to all citizens. The project was running ahead of schedule and under budget, another testament to Marcus's commitment to excellence in serving the justice system. On this crisp Tuesday morning, Marcus had spent the early hours inspecting the renovation progress, checking on the installation of new accessibility ramps and reviewing the upgraded lighting systems that would make the courthouse more welcoming and functional. He was dressed in his typical work attire, sturdy jeans, steel-toed boots, and a company polo shirt, carrying rolled blueprints and wearing the kind of clothes that demonstrated his hands-on approach to leadership. His plan was simple: complete his morning inspection, change into his tailored suit in the courthouse facilities, and then provide testimony that would help reshape an entire industry's approach to inclusion and fairness. What Marcus couldn't have anticipated was that he would become the subject of discrimination before he ever reached the witness stand. If you believe that justice should be blind to everything except the truth, hit that like button right now. Comment below about your thoughts on discrimination in places where it should never exist, and subscribe, because what happens when Marcus enters that courthouse will show you that the fight for equality is far from over, even in the places where we go seeking justice.
Right at that moment, Marcus walked through the courthouse's main entrance, carrying blueprints of the very building he was renovating. He had no idea that he was about to experience firsthand the discrimination he was scheduled to testify about. The irony was breathtaking. A man who had dedicated his career to creating equal access to justice was about to be denied that very access in his own construction project. The federal courthouse lobby buzzed with the typical Tuesday morning activity of lawyers hurrying to hearings, court reporters wheeling equipment cases, and citizens navigating the complex process of accessing justice. The marble floors that Marcus's crew had recently restored gleamed under the new LED lighting system his company had installed, creating an atmosphere of dignity and gravitas that he had specifically designed to make everyone feel that justice was within reach. Marcus approached the security checkpoint with the confidence of someone who belonged there, both as a scheduled witness and as the contractor responsible for the building's ongoing improvements. His steel-toed work boots echoed against the polished stone floors as he carried the rolled architectural plans for the courthouse's accessibility upgrades, documents that represented months of careful planning to make justice more accessible to citizens with disabilities. Court Security Officer Janet Mills looked up from her screening station and immediately made an assumption that would set in motion a chain of events exposing the very bias that Marcus was there to address. At 45, Janet had worked courthouse security for 12 years and prided herself in maintaining order and identifying potential problems before they could disrupt court proceedings. "Sir, I think you might be lost," Janet said, her tone carrying the kind of helpful condescension that people often used when they assumed someone didn't understand where they were. "Criminal court proceedings are on the second floor, and if you're here for sentencing or probation check-in, you'll need to take the elevator up and report to the clerk's office." The assumption hit Marcus like a physical blow. Janet had taken one look at a black man in work clothes and immediately concluded he must be a criminal defendant rather than a professional with legitimate business in the courthouse. The fact that he was carrying architectural plans and had the bearing of someone comfortable in professional settings didn't register in her prejudiced assessment. Deputy Clerk Thomas Rivera, overhearing the interaction from his information desk, stepped forward with the eager helpfulness of someone who thought he was preventing a confused individual from wasting the court's time. At 28, Thomas was relatively new to courthouse operations, but had quickly absorbed the unwritten rules about who typically belonged in different areas of the building. "Are you looking for public defender services?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious information to someone he assumed couldn't understand complex procedures. "If you don't have legal representation for your case, there's a process you need to follow before appearing in court." Marcus felt the familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief that came with being prejudged based on his appearance. Here he was, standing in a courthouse he was renovating, scheduled to provide expert testimony about discrimination, and being treated exactly like the countless other successful black professionals who had shared their stories of being assumed to be criminals, defendants, or individuals in need of help, rather than accomplished experts. "Actually, I'm here as an expert witness," Marcus replied, his voice maintaining the professional calm that had served him well in decades of navigating predominantly white business environments. "I'm scheduled to testify in the Richardson versus Pinnacle construction case this morning." Thomas's eyebrows rose in obvious skepticism, his expression suggesting that Marcus was either confused about his role or attempting to misrepresent his purpose for being in the courthouse. The idea that a casually dressed black man could be an expert witness in a federal discrimination case seemed to challenge Thomas's understanding of who qualified as a professional expert in legal proceedings.
But the skepticism was about to escalate into something far more damaging, because what happened next would prove that discrimination in the justice system wasn't just about individual prejudice, but about institutional assumptions that infected even the people responsible for maintaining order in the courts. Marcus was about to discover that his expertise would be questioned by the very system he was there to help reform. Court Administrator Sandra Walsh had been monitoring the interaction from her office overlooking the main lobby, and what she saw triggered her well-practiced crisis management instincts. At 55, Sandra had managed courthouse operations for 18 years and prided herself on maintaining the dignity and efficiency that federal proceedings required. Her job was to ensure that nothing disrupted the smooth functioning of justice, and she believed she was looking at a potential disruption that needed immediate attention. Sandra approached the security checkpoint with the authoritative stride of someone who had resolved countless situations involving confused or misguided individuals who didn't understand courthouse procedures. Her expression carried the mixture of professional concern and barely concealed irritation that came from dealing with what she perceived as another instance of someone trying to access proceedings they weren't qualified to participate in. "What seems to be the issue here?" Sandra asked, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, as she assessed Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a potential problem that needed to be managed efficiently and discreetly. Thomas stepped forward eagerly, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his vigilance to his supervisor. "This gentleman claims to be an expert witness in the Richardson case, but he doesn't have proper documentation and seems unclear about the procedures for professional witnesses." Sandra's eyes narrowed as she studied Marcus, taking in his work clothes, the blueprints under his arm, and his overall appearance. Her assessment was swift and definitive, shaped by years of assumptions about what expert witnesses looked like and how they presented themselves in federal court proceedings. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your attorney contact information and your case number," Sandra declared, her tone suggesting she was following proper protocols while actually creating barriers that didn't exist for legitimate expert witnesses. Expert witnesses in federal discrimination cases are typically represented by major law firms and have extensive documentation of their qualifications. Marcus maintained his professional composure, though he could feel the familiar burn of being presumed incompetent based solely on his appearance. "My testimony was arranged directly through the plaintiff's legal team. I can provide you with their contact information, but I don't believe expert witnesses are required to carry case numbers for identification purposes." Sandra's laugh carried the condescending tone of someone who believed she was dealing with an individual who didn't understand the complexities of federal court procedures. "Mr. Thompson Construction claimed expertise is particularly concerning given the technical nature of the testimony required in this case. We simply cannot have unqualified individuals attempting to provide expert testimony that could influence a federal discrimination ruling." The irony was staggering. Sandra had just questioned the qualifications of the very person whose company was renovating the courthouse she worked, whose expertise had been specifically requested by federal attorneys handling one of the most important discrimination cases of the year. Around them, attorneys and court staff began noticing the increasingly tense interaction, their conversations quieting as they sensed something significant was developing near the security checkpoint. Several people pulled out their phones, instinctively understanding that they might be witnessing something that would become a significant moment in courthouse history. Marcus glanced at his watch, realizing that Sandra's questioning was eating into the time he needed to change into his suit and prepare for his testimony. The woman who was supposed to facilitate justice was actively preventing him from participating in it, creating exactly the kind of barrier that the discrimination case was designed to address. What Sandra didn't realize was that her next decision would not only embarrass the courthouse, but would provide the most compelling evidence possible for the very discrimination case that Marcus was there to support.
No one expected what happened next would transform a routine security check into a federal case study of institutional bias. But Sandra Walsh was about to make an accusation so outrageous that it would expose the very discrimination that Marcus was scheduled to testify about. The courthouse administrator was about to provide the most compelling evidence possible for the plaintiff's case by targeting their star expert witness. Sandra's frustration with Marcus's calm persistence reached a boiling point as she realized that her standard intimidation tactics weren't working on someone who clearly understood courthouse procedures better than she had anticipated. In her mind, his composure and knowledge only confirmed her suspicion that this was a sophisticated attempt to fraudulently participate in federal proceedings. Chief Security Officer Robert Kane received Sandra's urgent summons with the efficiency of someone who had handled numerous situations involving individuals who didn't belong in federal court. At 52, Robert took enormous pride in maintaining the security and dignity that federal proceedings required, and he approached every potential threat with the calculated professionalism that had earned him recognition throughout the federal court system. But Robert's definition of threat was about to reveal itself as catastrophically flawed. "Robert, we have a serious situation here," Sandra announced, loud enough for the growing crowd of observers to hear every damaging word. "This individual is claiming expertise he clearly doesn't possess and may be attempting to commit perjury by providing false testimony in a federal discrimination case." The accusation hit the courthouse lobby like a bomb. Perjury was a federal felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison, and Sandra had just publicly accused Marcus of planning to commit a serious crime. The irony was breathtaking. She was accusing a man of lying about discrimination while simultaneously demonstrating exactly the kind of bias that federal courts were designed to address. Robert positioned himself strategically, creating a physical barrier between Marcus and the courtroom where his testimony was scheduled to begin in less than 30 minutes. His presence immediately escalated the situation from an administrative disagreement to what appeared to be a criminal investigation. Sandra continued building her case with the confidence of someone who believed she was protecting the integrity of the federal justice system. Expert witnesses in construction discrimination cases require extensive verification of their credentials and professional standing. This individual's claims about owning a major construction company are clearly fabricated, and his attempt to influence federal proceedings through false testimony represents a serious threat to judicial integrity. The accusation was devastating in its scope and implications. Sandra had just labeled Marcus as a fraud, a potential felon, and a threat to the justice system, all while standing in a courthouse that his company was renovating and in front of attorneys who were recording every word of her discriminatory tirade. Around them, the courthouse lobby had transformed into an impromptu courtroom where the very bias that federal discrimination law was designed to prevent was being displayed in real time. Lawyers, Court reporters and other court staff watched in stunned silence as a courthouse administrator provided a masterclass in institutional discrimination. Marcus felt the familiar childhood burn of being presumed guilty based on appearance, but this time it was mixed with the professional outrage of someone whose expertise and integrity were being publicly questioned by people who had no understanding of his qualifications or contributions to the justice system. Robert stepped forward with the authority of someone who believed he was about to prevent a federal crime. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. Attempting to provide false expert testimony is a serious federal offense, and we cannot allow you to proceed to the courtroom until we verify your identity and qualifications." The threat of arrest for attempting to testify about discrimination was so ironic it was almost surreal. Marcus was being threatened with criminal charges for trying to help the justice system address the very bias that was being demonstrated against him in real time. If this story is making you furious about how assumptions and prejudice can poison even our courts, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment about how discrimination affects trust in our justice system. And subscribe, because what happens when the truth comes out will prove that sometimes the most powerful evidence of bias comes from the people who are supposed to prevent it.
Right at that moment, Marcus made a strategic decision that would transform him from target to prosecutor, because what he did next would provide irrefutable evidence of the systematic bias that federal courts were supposed to eliminate. While Sandra and Robert thought they were preventing fraud, they were actually creating the most compelling documentation of discrimination that any federal judge had ever witnessed. Marcus looked at the crowd of courthouse staff and attorneys with the calm composure that had carried him through decades of fighting for contracts in an industry that often questioned his qualifications. He understood that this moment represented more than personal humiliation. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the very discrimination patterns that the Richardson case was designed to address, except now he had become the unwilling subject of his own expert witness testimony. "I understand your concerns about verification," Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had testified in federal court multiple times before. "Perhaps we could resolve this by contacting Federal Judge Patricia Williams, who is expecting my testimony this morning. She personally approved my expert witness designation and has copies of all my qualifications." Sandra's response revealed the depth of her institutional prejudice and her fundamental misunderstanding of how federal court procedures actually worked. "Judge Williams is preparing for important federal proceedings and cannot be interrupted to deal with individuals who are attempting to circumvent proper channels. Federal judges don't personally handle verification issues for unqualified witnesses." The dismissal was particularly damaging because Sandra had just demonstrated that she believed Judge Williams would waste time with unqualified witnesses, suggesting either that the judge was incompetent or that Sandra knew better than a federal judge about who was qualified to testify in discrimination cases. Robert stepped closer, his security training activating as he assessed what he continued to believe was an escalating fraud situation. "Sir, we're going to need you to provide comprehensive documentation of your claimed credentials. Anyone can say they own a construction company, but expert witness testimony requires verified professional standing that we clearly don't see here." Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew his contractor's license, his corporate identification for Thompson Construction and Development, and his business cards. "You can verify all of this information with the State Licensing Board." Sandra examined the documents with the skeptical attention of someone looking for evidence of forgery rather than verification of authenticity. Professional-looking fake documents are readily available, and we've seen sophisticated attempts to impersonate qualified individuals before. These could easily be fabricated credentials designed to gain access to federal proceedings. The accusation of document forgery added another federal crime to Sandra's growing list of charges against Marcus. She was now suggesting that he had committed identity fraud, document forgery, and attempted perjury, transforming a routine expert witness appearance into what she presented as a complex criminal conspiracy.
Marcus pulled out his smartphone and, with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that this conversation would be scrutinized by federal attorneys, activated his recording app. The distinctive chime echoed through the courthouse lobby, immediately drawing attention from every attorney and court reporter within earshot.
"I'm going to document this interaction for the record," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the professional tone of someone who understood legal procedures better than the court staff who were questioning him. "Given that I'm here to testify about discrimination in the construction industry, I believe this conversation is directly relevant to the federal case I'm scheduled to support." The mention of recording the interaction sent a visible wave of concern through Sandra and Robert, who suddenly realized that their handling of this situation might be subject to federal scrutiny. But instead of reconsidering their approach, they doubled down on their discriminatory assumptions. "Recording conversations in a federal courthouse without permission is another serious violation," Robert declared, though his understanding of federal recording laws was as flawed as his assessment of Marcus's credentials. "This behavior is becoming increasingly suspicious and suggests someone who is familiar with attempting to manipulate legal proceedings." Marcus calmly retrieved the architectural plans from under his arm and unrolled them on the security desk, revealing detailed blueprints of the courthouse renovation project. "These are the plans for the accessibility upgrades currently being installed in this building. Thompson Construction and Development is the general contractor for this $12 million federal renovation project." Sandra glanced at the professional blueprints, but dismissed them with the same prejudiced logic she had applied to everything else. "Anyone can obtain architectural plans, and we've seen individuals use construction documents to try to seem legitimate. The fact that you're carrying these plans doesn't prove you have any connection to the actual renovation project." Around them, the crowd of observers had grown to include several attorneys who were scheduled for proceedings in Judge Williams' courtroom. A few recognized Marcus from previous federal cases where he had provided expert testimony, but they watched in stunned silence as court staff systematically dismissed evidence that should have immediately resolved the situation. A young federal prosecutor standing near the information desk pulled out her phone and began recording, understanding that she was witnessing something that would likely become evidence in multiple federal cases. Her legal training told her that this interaction was documenting discrimination so blatant that it would support not just the Richardson case, but potentially a separate federal lawsuit against the courthouse itself. Marcus noticed that several attorneys were now actively documenting the interaction, creating a record that would be impossible for the courthouse administration to deny or dismiss. "I'm scheduled to testify in 20 minutes about discrimination in federal contracting. Perhaps you could explain to Judge Williams why her expert witness is being detained by court staff who refuse to verify his credentials through standard procedures." Sandra's final response would later be cited in federal court as evidence of institutional bias so profound that it required systematic intervention. "We don't need to bother federal judges with situations involving individuals who clearly don't belong in federal proceedings. Real expert witnesses don't show up looking like construction workers and don't need to argue their way into courtrooms." The phrase, "don't belong in federal proceedings," was captured by multiple recording devices and would become central evidence in a discrimination case that would transform courthouse operations nationwide. Sandra had just provided a textbook example of the very bias that federal civil rights law was designed to eliminate.
But the moment of truth had finally arrived, and what happened next would become the most devastating exposure of institutional bias ever documented in a federal courthouse, transforming a discrimination trial into a real-time demonstration of the very prejudice that federal courts were designed to prevent. The people who thought they were protecting justice were about to discover they had been attacking the person who was literally building it. The courthouse lobby had reached a breaking point as Sandra prepared to have Marcus arrested for attempting to testify about discrimination in the very building his company was renovating. The irony was so profound that legal scholars would later study this incident as the ultimate example of how bias can blind institutions to their own contradictions. That's when federal judge Patricia Williams emerged from her chambers, prompted by her clerk's concerned report that there seemed to be an unusual delay with the expert witness who was crucial to the morning's proceedings. Judge Williams had personally reviewed Marcus's qualifications, approved his expert witness designation, and was expecting testimony that would provide critical evidence for one of the most important federal discrimination cases of the year. Judge Williams's face went through a series of expressions that would later be analyzed in legal ethics courses. Initial confusion as she tried to understand why her courthouse lobby had become the scene of what appeared to be a major security incident. Growing concern as she recognized Marcus at the center of the commotion, and then absolute shock as she realized that her court staff was detaining the very expert witness whose testimony was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. "Mr. Thompson!" Judge Williams's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a judicial gavel, her tone carrying both relief at finding her missing expert witness and mounting horror as she began to understand what was happening. "What on earth is going on here? You're our lead expert witness and the contractor renovating this entire courthouse." The words hit Sandra, Robert, Janet, and Thomas like a judicial earthquake. The title, Mr. Thompson, immediately commanded respect in a federal courthouse, but it was the phrase, contractor renovating this entire courthouse, that sent shockwaves through everyone who had participated in his harassment. Sandra's confident expression disintegrated as the full scope of her catastrophic error began to register. The man she had accused of document forgery was not only a legitimate expert witness, but was literally the person responsible for improving the very building where she worked. Her face went through a spectrum of colors that suggested she might need medical attention. Marcus looked at Judge Williams with the composed dignity of someone who had endured 45 minutes of systematic discrimination and was finally ready to address it through proper legal channels. "Your Honor, I was attempting to check in for my scheduled testimony when your court staff decided I didn't belong in federal proceedings. They've accused me of document forgery, attempted perjury, and planning to commit federal crimes." The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive. Judge Williams's horror was visible as she processed the fact that her own courthouse staff had just demonstrated the very discrimination that the Richardson case was designed to address, creating evidence so compelling that it would likely overshadow the original trial.
Marcus continued with the measured authority of someone who had spent decades providing expert testimony in federal courts. "I'm Marcus Thompson, Chief Executive Officer of Thompson Construction and Development. My company holds the $12 million federal contract to renovate this courthouse, and I'm here to provide expert testimony about discrimination in federal contracting. Your staff just provided a real-time demonstration of exactly the kind of bias this case is meant to address." He reached for his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents that would seal the fate of everyone who had questioned his credentials. "Here's my federal contractor certification, my expert witness approval from your chambers, my company's federal renovation contract, and the architectural plans for the accessibility improvements currently being installed in this building." Judge Williams examined the documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her courthouse had just become the subject of a federal discrimination incident that would have far-reaching legal consequences. Her voice carried the weight of judicial authority when she addressed her staff. "These are legitimate credentials from a qualified expert witness whose company is currently under federal contract to improve this courthouse. Mr. Thompson's qualifications were personally reviewed and approved by my chambers, and his testimony is critical to federal proceedings that begin in 10 minutes. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the gathered crowd of attorneys, court reporters, and courthouse staff. Everyone present understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary: the systematic discrimination of a federal contractor and expert witness by the very institution he was there to help. Robert, who had been so confident about preventing federal fraud, now stood frozen as he realized he had just threatened to arrest one of the most qualified construction executives in the federal contracting system. His security training had never prepared him for the possibility that the person he was removing might be more qualified than the people giving him orders. Sandra found her voice first, though it came out as a desperate whisper that revealed her complete understanding of the career-ending disaster she had created. "Judge Williams, Mr. Thompson, I can explain what happened here. We were following security protocols and had no way of knowing his credentials were legitimate. This was obviously a terrible misunderstanding." But Judge Williams had heard enough excuses, and what she said next would become a landmark moment in federal courthouse administration, setting precedent for how discrimination in judicial settings would be addressed and prevented. The woman who had dedicated her career to ensuring equal justice under law was about to deliver a verdict that would transform not just her courthouse, but the entire federal court system's approach to preventing institutional bias.
But there would be no excuses accepted in Judge Williams' courtroom, because what happened next would demonstrate that federal judges don't tolerate discrimination in their own buildings, especially when it targets the very people working to improve access to justice. The 4 court staff members, who had spent 45 minutes systematically harassing a federal contractor, were about to discover that actions in federal buildings have federal consequences. Judge Williams looked at her court staff with the expression of someone who had just watched her institution's reputation destroyed in real time by the very people she trusted to uphold its dignity. Her voice carried the weight of federal judicial authority when she addressed the crowd that had gathered to witness this unprecedented breakdown of courthouse professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed today is an inexcusable failure of our court's commitment to equal treatment under law. Mr. Marcus Thompson, a qualified expert witness and federal contractor, has been subjected to discriminatory treatment that violates every principle this courthouse is meant to embody." The public reprimand sent shockwaves through the federal courthouse community as attorneys and staff realized they were witnessing judicial accountability being delivered in real time. Judge Williams was creating a record that would be studied in legal ethics courses and cited in discrimination cases for decades to come. Court Administrator Sandra Walsh, who had been so confident about protecting federal proceedings from fraudulent witnesses, now faced the reality that she had just created the most damaging discrimination incident in her courthouse's history. Her face showed the full comprehension that her career in federal court administration was ending in the most public and humiliating way possible. "Your Honor," Sandra began, her voice cracking with desperation, "I take full responsibility for this situation. We were following what we believed were proper security protocols, and I had no intention of discriminating against Mr. Thompson or anyone else." Judge Williams' response was swift and uncompromising. "Sandra, there are no security protocols that authorize racial profiling in federal buildings. There are no procedures that justify questioning legitimate credentials based on assumptions about appearance. What happened here wasn't about security, it was about prejudice, and it will have immediate consequences." Chief Security Officer Robert Kane, who had been so certain about preventing federal fraud, now stood before a federal judge knowing that he had just threatened to arrest a legitimate expert witness and federal contractor. His security training had taught him to protect the courthouse from threats, but he had failed to recognize that the biggest threat to judicial integrity was his own biased assumptions.
Judge Williams, ma'am, I was responding to reports of suspicious behavior and was trying to maintain courthouse security, Robert stammered, his confidence completely shattered. I had no way of knowing Mr. Thompson's legitimate status and was following the administrator's guidance. Marcus stepped forward with the composed authority of someone who had just witnessed a masterclass in institutional discrimination and was ready to address its broader implications. Your Honor, what happened here today demonstrates exactly the kind of systematic bias that the Richardson case is designed to address. If federal court staff can discriminate against a federal contractor in a federal building, how can we trust that justice is being administered fairly to ordinary citizens?
The question hung in the courthouse lobby like an indictment of the entire federal justice system. Everyone present understood that Marcus had just articulated the fundamental problem with institutional bias. When discrimination infects the institutions meant to prevent it, the entire system's credibility is compromised. Judge Williams addressed the gathered crowd with the solemnity of someone announcing institutional reform that would extend far beyond her courthouse. This incident has exposed serious failures in our court's culture and procedures. We will be implementing comprehensive changes to ensure this never happens again, and we will be transparent about our efforts to create a truly inclusive environment for all who seek justice. The promise of systematic reform was captured by multiple recording devices, creating a commitment that would be monitored by civil rights organizations and legal ethics watchdogs across the country. Judge Williams had just committed her courthouse to becoming a model for preventing discrimination in federal judicial settings. Court Security Officer Janet Mills and Deputy Clerk Thomas Rivera, who had initiated the discriminatory treatment, watched in stunned silence as their assumptions about who belonged in federal court destroyed their professional futures. Their initial prejudiced assessments had escalated into a federal discrimination incident that would follow them throughout their careers. Judge Williams announced the immediate consequences with the finality of someone delivering a federal verdict. Sandra Walsh, your position as court administrator is suspended pending a full investigation by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Robert Kane, your security contract is terminated effective immediately. Janet Mills and Thomas Rivera, you are suspended from courthouse duties pending review. The swift accountability sent a clear message that reverberated through the federal courthouse system. Discrimination would have immediate and serious consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's position or intentions. But the terminations and suspensions were only the beginning of the transformation that would follow. Marcus addressed the crowd with the vision of someone who understood that this painful incident could become a catalyst for meaningful change. This experience, as difficult as it was, provides an opportunity to examine how our justice system treats people based on assumptions rather than qualifications. If we're serious about equal justice under law, we need to ensure that bias has no place in any federal building. The attorneys present began recording even more intensively, understanding they were witnessing not just an incident, but the birth of a movement that would transform how federal courts examined their own practices and prevented institutional discrimination. What happened next would turn this single courthouse incident into a nationwide reform movement that would protect countless future visitors from experiencing the discrimination that Marcus had endured in a building he was working to improve.
But suspending 4 discriminatory court staff was only the beginning of Marcus's vision for reforming the federal justice system, because what happened over the next 90 days would transform not just one courthouse, but the entire federal court system's approach to preventing institutional bias. The man who had been escorted out of his own renovation project was about to become the architect of the most comprehensive anti-discrimination reforms in federal courthouse history. Marcus's testimony in the Richardson versus Pinnacle construction case became legendary in federal civil rights law, not just because of his expertise on construction industry discrimination, but because he had just provided real-time evidence of bias occurring in the very building where justice was supposed to be blind to everything except the truth. His experience transformed from personal humiliation into compelling legal precedent that would protect countless future courthouse visitors. Judge Williams addressed the packed courtroom with the gravity of someone announcing institutional change that would reverberate throughout the federal judiciary. Mr. Thompson's experience in our courthouse today has demonstrated that discrimination can infect even the institutions designed to prevent it. This court will lead by example in ensuring that bias has no place in federal judicial proceedings. Over the following 3 months, Marcus worked directly with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts to implement what became known as the Justice Equity Protocol, a comprehensive program that addressed discrimination in federal buildings with the same systematic approach he had used to build his construction empire and renovate government facilities. The first component was mandatory bias recognition training for all federal court personnel. But this wasn't the typical government workshop that employees endured and forgot. Marcus brought in federal judges, civil rights attorneys, and most powerfully, individuals who had experienced discrimination in courthouse settings. The training sessions were filmed and distributed to all 94 federal district courts, creating a resource that transformed how court staff understood their role in ensuring equal access to justice. The second innovation was the establishment of diverse hiring and promotion programs that actively recruited court staff from the same communities that federal courts served. The logic was revolutionary but simple. If you want to welcome people from all backgrounds, your staff should reflect that diversity, rather than maintaining the homogeneous workforce that had perpetuated discriminatory assumptions. The third element was the implementation of dignity protocols that established clear procedures for treating every courthouse visitor with respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived economic status. These protocols included specific language for greeting visitors, mandatory verification procedures before questioning anyone's legitimacy, and immediate escalation to judicial officers for any discrimination concerns. The technology component involved installing interaction monitoring systems that tracked the quality of staff-visitor interactions and identified patterns of differential treatment. When potential bias was detected, supervisors received immediate alerts and were required to intervene in real time to prevent discrimination from escalating into the kind of incident that Marcus had experienced. The transparency element was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the reforms. Monthly reports were published showing visitor satisfaction scores broken down by demographic groups, average interaction quality measurements, and detailed analysis of any discrimination complaints. This transparency created accountability that extended throughout the federal court system and provided a model that state courts began adopting. The human cost of the discrimination was addressed through federal employment consequences that sent clear messages about accountability. Sandra, Robert, Janet, and Thomas found themselves permanently barred from federal court employment and faced difficulties securing positions in any justice-related field. The viral footage of their behavior became a training tool used in government ethics programs across multiple agencies.
But Marcus's vision extended beyond punishment to genuine institutional transformation. He established a federal justice access program that provided bias education and community engagement opportunities for court personnel, creating pathways for building understanding between federal courts and the diverse communities they served. The courthouse renovation project that Marcus had been inspecting when he was discriminated against became a showcase for inclusive federal building design. The accessibility improvements were expanded to include cultural sensitivity features, multilingual signage, and community spaces that made federal justice more welcoming to all citizens. The transformation results were dramatic and measurable. Visitor satisfaction scores in federal courthouses increased by 45% within the first quarter after implementation. Discrimination complaints dropped by 87% across all participating federal districts. Most importantly, surveys showed that citizens from diverse backgrounds felt significantly more confident about receiving fair treatment in federal court proceedings. The Richardson case itself became a landmark victory that established new precedent for addressing discrimination in federal contracting, with Marcus's courthouse experience serving as central evidence of how bias could infect even institutions designed to prevent it. The case resulted in court-ordered reforms that opened billions of dollars in federal contracts to minority-owned businesses. The story's impact extended far beyond the federal court system. Marcus was invited to testify before Congress about discrimination in government buildings and was appointed to a federal advisory committee on courthouse accessibility and inclusion. The Justice Equity Protocol was featured in Constitutional Law Review as a case study in institutional reform and accountability. Other government agencies began implementing similar programs, creating a ripple effect that improved public service experiences across multiple federal departments. The viral footage of Marcus's experience sparked nationwide conversations about respect, dignity, and the assumptions that government employees make about who deserves equal treatment. 1 year after the incident, Marcus returned to the same federal courthouse to receive a commendation from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts for his contributions to federal justice reform. The ceremony was held in the renovated lobby where he had been discriminated against, with federal judges, court administrators, and civil rights leaders celebrating the transformation that had emerged from institutional failure. During his acceptance speech, Marcus shared the lesson that had emerged from his painful experience. Justice isn't just about the decisions made in courtrooms, it's about how every person is treated from the moment they walk through our doors. When we create truly inclusive federal buildings, we don't just prevent discrimination, we strengthen democracy by ensuring that justice is accessible to everyone who seeks it. The story of Marcus Thompson didn't just end 4 careers and reform 1 courthouse. It started a nationwide movement toward inclusive federal justice that proved government institutions could transform themselves when confronted with evidence of their own bias. Today, federal courthouses across America display plaques commemorating the Thompson reforms that ensure every visitor receives dignified treatment regardless of their appearance or background. Marcus's experience stands as proof that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for institutional change comes from exposing the discrimination that hides within the very institutions meant to prevent it, and that one person's courage to demand equal treatment can create protections that benefit countless others seeking justice in federal courts.
Marcus Thompson's transformation of the federal courthouse system proves something profound. When institutions confront their own bias instead of defending it, justice becomes stronger for everyone. 4 court staff members lost their careers in 1 day, but their discrimination became the foundation for reforms that increased public trust in federal courts by 45% and created the most inclusive justice system in American history. The Justice Equity Protocol that emerged from Marcus's humiliation didn't just prevent future discrimination, it opened courthouse doors to communities who had previously felt unwelcome, proving that accountability isn't just morally necessary, it strengthens democracy itself. Here's what Marcus taught us that goes beyond courthouse walls. The person you judge based on appearance could be the exact person whose work makes your mission possible. Sandra, Robert, Janet, and Thomas made assumptions based on stereotypes and destroyed their professional futures in a building that Marcus was literally improving. But Marcus chose institutional transformation over personal revenge,
creating systems that ensure no citizen would ever experience discrimination while seeking justice in federal court. The real lesson isn't about hidden contractors or dramatic courthouse reveals. It's about understanding that justice begins with how we treat every person who walks through our doors, whether they're wearing work boots or business suits, whether they look like our expectations or challenge our assumptions. Because equal treatment under law isn't just a constitutional principle, it's a daily choice that every government employee makes when they decide whether to serve citizens with dignity or prejudice. Marcus Thompson turned his moment of institutional discrimination into a nationwide movement that now protects millions of Americans who seek justice in federal buildings. His story reminds us that change happens when successful people refuse to accept bias as normal, when institutions take responsibility for examining their own practices, and when ordinary citizens, like those who recorded this incident, choose to document injustice rather than ignore it. The courthouse that once questioned whether a black man belonged in federal proceedings now leads the nation in inclusive justice practices, proving that even our most sacred institutions can transform when confronted with evidence of their own failures. Marcus's renovation work didn't just improve the building's accessibility, it rebuilt the foundation of trust between federal courts and the diverse communities they serve. If this story made you think about how bias can hide even in places dedicated to preventing it, hit that like button right now, because accountability and justice matter more than ever. Drop a comment about your thoughts on discrimination in government institutions, or share a time when someone stood up for equal treatment despite facing powerful opposition. And subscribe to our channel because we're committed to sharing stories about people who transform systems instead of just complaining about them, who build bridges toward justice instead of walls around privilege, and who prove that sometimes the most powerful response to institutional bias is forcing institutions to become better than they ever thought possible. Your subscription helps us find these stories that remind us why demanding equal treatment isn't just about individual dignity, it's about protecting the foundation of justice for everyone.